Can you imagine? This flawless sugar cube was once known as white gold in the 19th century. It was a class symbol and a decor of death. The elite wore dead men's teeth, while slaves irrigated sweetness with blood. This isn't just sugar, it's a bloody global deception. Welcome to the hidden cost. Today we reveal the filthiest secrets hidden behind sugar. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire was at the zenith of its power, and nothing symbolized this dominance quite like the sugar bowl. To the Victorian elite, whiteness was not just a color. It was a moral imperative, a class marker that separated the refined from the raw. If you sat in a drawing room in Belgravia in 1851, the purity of your sugar reflected the purity of your soul. But this gleaming, snow-white cube was a masterpiece of deception. It was a manufactured obsession that required the systematic scrubbing of nature's impurities. To achieve this, the industry turned to a dark alchemy that combined the heavy machinery of the Industrial Revolution with the visceral remains of the animal kingdom. We are taught to see sugar as a simple treat, but in reality, it was the first global commodity to be whitened at any cost. In the 1700s, sugar was white gold, a luxury so expensive it was kept under lock and key in ornate caskets. But by the time Sir Henry Tate revolutionized sugar refining in the 1870s, the empire's appetite had become an insatiable monster. The average Briton's consumption skyrocketed from 4 pounds a year in 1700 to a staggering 90 pounds by the end of the 19th century. Sugar was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, providing a cheap, caloric high for factory workers in Manchester and Leeds who were too exhausted to eat real meals. But as the lower orders began to consume brown sugar, the upper classes demanded something more exclusive. They wanted sugar that was double refined, sugar that had been stripped of its molasses, its minerals, and its history. This demand for hyperpurity created a massive logistical nightmare. How to turn millions of tons of dark, sticky muscovado into the pristine crystals demanded by London society. The refineries of Whitechapel and Greenock were not places of sweetness, they were hellish chemical laboratories. To achieve that coveted porcelain white, refiners used a process that would horrify a modern consumer. First, they used fining agents, massive quantities of bull's blood, collected from local slaughterhouses, were stirred into the boiling raw sugar vats. The blood's albumin would coagulate under heat, rising to the surface as a thick, disgusting scum, dragging the dirt and vegetable fibers with it. But even blood wasn't enough. The final secret to Victorian whiteness was bone char. In massive kills, the bones of countless cattle, and sometimes, as rumors suggested, other remains, were burned in the absence of air to create a powerful carbon filter. By 1850, Britain was importing thousands of tons of bones specifically for this purpose. The syrup was passed through deep beds of this black, charred death to emerge clear and colorless. It was a staggering irony. The most civilized product on the tea table was literally filtered through the carbonized skeletons of the dead. As these snow-white crystals dance in the brutal centrifuges and eventually stack into mountains, what we witness is far more than a condiment. It is the terminus of an industrial baptism. This morbid pursuit of purity was, in fact, a colossal act of collective hypnosis. Inside the refineries of London and Greenock, we filtered life through death, washing away filth with charred remnants. Every sugar cube resting on a delicate Victorian tea table was a brick in this tower of bones. This is the truth of bleaching. Civilization was not born of purity, but of the systematic concealment, filtration, and erasure of the filthy and the bloody. But the true cost of this pristine whiteness was paid long before the sugar ever reached the cobblestones of London's docks. In the so-called sugar islands of Barbados, Antigua, and Jamaica, the plantation was never a farm. It was a factory of death, a landscape engineered for human extraction. On a typical estate like Worthy Park in Jamaica, life was governed by the brutal logic of the 7-year cycle. To the plantation owners, an enslaved person was a depreciating asset. It was mathematically cheaper to work a human being to death in 7 years and buy a replacement than it was to sustain a healthy, aging workforce. When crop time arrived, the pace became demonic. The mills ran 24 hours a day, fueled by the blood and bone of the exhausted. One of the most terrifying symbols of this era was the 3-roller vertical mill. As workers fed the stalks into the relentless iron rollers by torchlight, fatigue became a lethal weapon. If a worker's fingers were snagged by the fiber, the iron rollers would not stop for flesh. This is why a sharpened hatchet was kept hanging on the mill post at all times, not for the cane, but to amputate a worker's arm at the shoulder before their entire body was pulled into the crushing gears. The juice that pooled below was literally a mixture of sucrose, sweat, and human misery. Historians estimate that in the 18th century, for every single ton of sugar that reached Europe, 1 human life was extinguished in the Caribbean sun. This was the blood sugar that fueled the modern world. The immense profits generated from this meat grinder didn't just buy luxury, they built the foundations of the global financial system. As the refined elite in London stirred their tea, they were stirring the liquid dividends of a holocaust. The whiteness of the sugar served to bleach the blood off the money, turning a history of violence into a clean, marketable commodity. We are not just looking at a condiment, we are looking at the invisible architecture of empire, built on a foundation of crushed bone and stolen time. By the 1830s, Britain's sweet tooth had become a national disaster. Sugar was no longer a luxury, it was a mass addiction rotting the empire from within. As refined sucrose ravaged the mouths of the aristocracy, blackened teeth became a perverse status symbol, visible proof that you were wealthy enough to afford the very substance destroying you. But when the pain and decay became unbearable, the elite demanded a solution more vital than porcelain. They wanted real human bone. This created the Waterloo Teeth trade. In 1815, as smoke cleared over 50,000 fallen soldiers at Waterloo, an army of resurrectionists descended. Armed with pliers, these looters roamed the Belgian mud, harvesting thousands of healthy teeth from dead young men, soldiers who died defending the empire that would now wear their remains as accessories. These battlefield harvests were shipped by the barrelful to London, sanitized, and fitted into the mouths of the wealthy. The irony was bone-chilling. The British elite were trapped in a cannibalistic cycle, consuming sugar produced by enslaved labor, losing their teeth to the addiction, and replacing them with the remains of their own fallen soldiers. A civilization literally wearing its casualties to sustain a mask of perfection. As the nobleman smiled in his mirror with a dead man's teeth, he would reach for another crystal of white gold, and the cycle would begin again. The industrial refineries of the 19th century have evolved into the multinational corporations of the 21st. We no longer use bull's blood, and we no longer wear the teeth of dead soldiers, but the underlying mechanics of hidden costs remain unchanged. Sugar is hidden in 75% of processed foods today, a silent architect of global obesity and environmental degradation in places like the Amazon and Southeast Asia. When you stir your coffee today, remember the history in those crystals. Every grain is a debt, and every cube is a monument to a cost that was never meant to be paid by the person enjoying the sweetness. Who paid? Look back at the bone char and the blood. The price was paid by everyone but us.